G'day guys, this is a bit of a supplemental on the countries that are most vulnerable to the future food crisis due to the Ukrainian situation. So let me just share the screen. So this is exports out of the Ukraine. So this is back in 2016, 2020, obviously. We've had conflicts since then, but these are the main countries that are purchasing, and they've got like future contracts. I think I did mention some of them. We sort of covered the obvious ones. When it comes to wheat exports, Egypt is the main one. Indonesia, Bangladesh, Philippines, Morocco, Thailand, Tunisia, a well-known one for instability, South Korea, Turkey, another very vulnerable one, and India. They're probably less vulnerable because of their relationship with Russia. Then when it comes to maize, the most vulnerable nation to exports out of the Ukraine is basically China. Egypt again. That's why Egypt is really in a difficult spot. When you're looking at this is in billions of dollars worth of trade, $2.34 billion worth of trade. One bushel, which is about 36, around about the imperial and the US metric, they vary a bit, 35 to, probably about between the two, it's around about 35.5 or 36 for the imperial system of a bushel. The current price is about, I think it's around $11.50 per bushel. And so if you sort of divide that, you'll be able to get the amount of, now I think that in the past, the price was slightly lower. So you're probably buying more bushels per. So then if you do the numbers, it ends up something like 5.5 plus 5.6 million tons of wheat from the Ukraine for that sort of amount of money. To give you just an idea, a general, without doing, I'm not going to cover. People can go and do their own numbers. These are the sort of vulnerable for maize, obviously, China, Egypt, Netherlands, Spain, Italy, Iran, Turkey, again, Israel, Portugal, and Germany. So those are the vulnerable countries from exports out of the Ukraine. Exports out of Russia, again, Egypt right at the top, Turkey, again, right at the top. For maize, it's pretty much Iran and Turkey. Then you've got Bangladesh, Sudan, Nigeria, Azerbaijan, Yemen. Yemen has got a lot of problems at the moment. All they need is more food crisis problems. They're already in a very difficult state. Vietnam, United Arab Emirates, and Tanzania, depending on how you like to prefer it. When it comes to maize, it's Iran, Turkey, South Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, the Netherlands, Japan, Latvia, Georgia, and Greece. Greece is probably the least exposed out of all of them. They do have some domestic production. Biggest problem in Europe as well is that domestic production has been curtailed due to the common European agricultural policy to keep prices up and all that. And a lot of farmers are being paid to literally not produce in many cases. So that's been a really debacle, and now trying to get all that going again. And this is why people have been putting windmills and solar farms on their property rather than planting, agricultural products. So that's a problem with the buffoons, not the buffons, but the buffoons in Brussels and their sort of policy. So it's just to give you an idea of the countries that are directly purchasing from these countries. So obviously, Egypt is not going to basically be limiting its imports, but obviously Russia's holding back to some extent, which means that these countries aren't able to source, because Russia also provides, and the Ukraine, a much more competitively priced product compared to the US or Australia or Canada or countries like that. So most of these countries, if they have to source stuff and compete with other countries over Australian harvests, North American harvests, they're going to be paying a premium, and the amount that they'll be able to access in terms of kibble food sources is going to be much harder for these specific countries. So that's where just to give you an idea, if you do live in one of those countries or you've got relatives in one of those countries, the problem is going to become acute by around about September onwards, and will go very extreme next year. You've also got, at the moment, while the majority of the southern part of the Ukraine has been occupied at the moment, that's a sort of situation to give you an idea. So there's Odessa. So, and really down here, you can forget it. It's really this area where some stuff is sort of getting out, very little, as you know. And then the problem is then they have to rail it all the way up here in order to, and then you've got the different gauges, you've got tracks that are damaged. It's just a minefield. Not enough trucks, not enough cranes to move the stuff fast enough. It's a mess. And at the moment, there's, I think it's, the numbers are something in the range of 24 or 26, people are just not sure exactly, million tons are basically sitting in silos. So they're pretty much captive of the country. You've got a massive amount, and you've only got a trickle coming out at the moment of 0.5 ton out of Odessa, and there's probably a bit going into through the west, and maybe a couple of tons potentially, and even that is really being curtailed. The biggest problem is, as we move into spring and summer, these summer months, and things warm up, what will happen is a lot of this stored in silos, not being ventilated, not enough electricity, all these problems, a lot of it's going to rot. So these 24 to 26 million tons, and remember, Egypt is buying about, they buy about from both Russia but just from the Ukraine, it's 5.5 million tons are one of their biggest customers, and only about 0.5 tons coming out per month, which is just a trickle, and that's their total amount at the moment. From Odessa, and it's probably another bit of that, much less coming through here, through the west. It's probably about 0.1 or maybe 0.2 of a ton if you're lucky. So we're talking about very little amounts. It's not very clear how much is actually getting out of Odessa at the moment. It may be even less. So overall, it may be even less than 0.5 ton. So we're talking about, if we're looking at a yearly situation, we're looking at about 5 tons for the, 5 or 6 tons for the whole year. and that's about a quarter of the entire stored at the moment. Usually they have double that. They have a bigger production because there's a coming season. But is that season going to be very effective? Going to turn out well? It's not looking really well at the moment, guys. And there are so many countries that are very vulnerable in terms of food security, and they're going to become even more vulnerable. And as the supply is constricted later this year, September onwards, and especially next year, obviously in countries like Australasia, North America, and all that, you're probably going to get about a certain amount of increase. Some things not being on the shelves anymore, or supply issues are going to dwindle, but you're not going to get a massive increase in pricing. There will be some food inflation, but it won't be massive. But in some of these other countries that are more vulnerable, where large parts of their they've got contracts which are not being fulfilled, and so they're going to be massively short, and they'll have to go into the open market and pay at a premium to try and get a sourcing of additional of these key foods that these societies consume. And that's going to be a problem in terms of being able to provide sufficient food energy for a lot of people around the world. There's going to be a lot of hunger, and there's going to be a lot of undernourishment in the next 2 to 3 years, because even if you basically stop the war tomorrow, it's going to still take about 12 months, maybe a bit more, to get all the supply lines and everything back to normal, and maybe even longer if you have to rebuild infrastructure and stuff like that. So it's not an easy situation. At least this crisis is going to be quite acute in the next 2 years. That's quite clear. I don't think we can get away from that. That's a reality. So that's the current situation on the actual battlefield. I was actually looking at, as a bonus, outside the food security issues and all that, for those who like geopolitics and all that, this is an envelopment. That's the Ukrainian forces. And pretty much, if you take a look, they actually do all these little pockets. They splinter pockets out their major concentration, and they basically move in and envelop. And that's what the Russians have been doing. It's a very interesting strategy. And unfortunately, Zelensky doesn't understand what the Russians are doing. Even though he outnumbers them, he's got about 600,000 troops. They only have 100,000 troops on the front lines and 75,000 close to the Russian borders as, like a security, just in case they're needed, but they're not actively involved. He's actually using 100,000 against, a much lesser, and he's basically doing these envelopments, continuously these envelopments, and even and using artillery to hammer and anvil and push in that regard. I think he actually, even up here, I'll just show you, when he came into here in Kiev and all that, he actually stopped. I believe this was one of the biggest feints in basically military history. He basically, by moving up here, he forced, because he actually moved into here, didn't really want this territory. This is the territory he wanted. But what he did was he actually forced the Ukrainians to split their forces to basically have a very long line of defense. Got it? And then he was able to swoop through here very rapidly and secure this much easier. And so he created a feint here. Anybody that understands military terms that understands what I mean. And this is a brilliant strategy. I think people are going to be talking about this for a long time. I don't think people understood, because he sat back, and then it reminds me of, Alexander the Great at the Hydaspes River in the 323, where he was sitting Porus was on the other side, and he was basically, deliberately just leaving his troops there, bringing in grain and supplies and all that, and acting, oh, we're here for the long haul, and we'll slowly move in, and we'll find the appropriate time to move on you. And so lowering also the anxiety level, but at the same time, there was still that threat. So he had to keep his forces there. While Alexander split his forces, moved about 17 miles up the stream, which is about 27 kilometers, and then came from across the river at an appropriate spot and caught him by surprise, and then basically vaporized his forces. So I think this was a brilliant strategy. That's why the Americans have realized that. That's why they're desperate trying to get artillery into this area so they can actually counteract these small envelopments that they're doing, and basically just grabbing bits and bits and bits and bits and bits continuously, because they had about 23% in the beginning of the war. They relinquished all this, but through these little envelopments, they grabbed quite a bit right through here. So, it's a brilliant, you're outnumbered 6-1 technically, and you're actually using artillery and envelopments to basically capture areas in a very interesting way, So I basically take my hat off to them, the way they're going about it. And once this served its purpose, he withdrew the forces, moved them all the way around here, and brought them back in through here. And some of them were kept along the borders, that's 75,000, just for the purposes of, just in case. But yes, quite brilliant. And they ended up using a lot of ammo, a lot of equipment that they got supplied with, and really ended up not using it as effective as they could. And now they're basically bogged into these envelopments, one after the other, and constricted. There's quite a few areas where they were out at about 89 kilometers, and then it just sort of collapsed inwards to about 60 odd kilometers, and then it really became untenable. They were asking, we need to withdraw, sort of things, and then it was just too late. The problem is Zelensky doesn't want to give up any territory, but he doesn't realize that, the tactics that are being used at the moment by the Russians are quite ingenious, using, having less numbers, but using really strategically, wisely, artillery and envelopment combinations. So quite interesting for those who are into this sort of stuff. But getting back to what I was saying earlier, we're talking about a massive amount of grain at the moment sitting in silos. It's hard to know exactly. Some people estimate it's anywhere between 24 to 26 million tons. I'm not sure what it is. It's around about somewhere. It's definitely over 20 million tons of grains. The problem is, as the warmer months come along, and without proper, power, ventilation, and stuff like that, a lot of that's going to rot. It's been in there for quite some time. It should have been exported quite some time. It hasn't. Nobody's caring about it. It's really a mess. And there are quite a few countries, as I showed on that list, quite a few countries that are quite vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that other countries aren't going to be affected, because obviously these countries, for their own security, their own ability to maintain civil order within their countries, they will have to go out, and there will be, like international programs. Probably the US to some of those countries will be forced to give them certain, money at a very low interest or some sort of agreement, because after all, they did create a lot of this mess. If they don't, they're going to have basically explosions throughout the entire North Africa, Southeast Asia, and many other parts are going to be quite a mess. It's bad enough at the moment in Indonesia and countries like that. There's still a large proportion of people that are undernourished. So the last thing you need to really push these societies into an extreme state. They already have, there is already some radicalization in those communities. You don't want to basically give them legs, so to speak, to become a strong factor within those societies. So that's the vulnerable societies. That's the sort of situation. There's a supplemental just to give you an idea what's happening. It will affect everyone else as well, because obviously when you've got a diminished amount of product in the market, you're going to have competition, and the prices, expect the prices to really escalate after September, you know. So at the moment, they're going up and down, but they're sort of steadily still on the upward trajectory. But once, you know, we get into the September period and, you know, a lot of those contracts are not completed and not fulfilled, the pricing is going to escalate and the food insecurity is going to escalate. So how long that's going to last, whether it's going to be 1.5 to 2 years, I don't know whether it's going to be longer. Depends on how long this conflict is, depends on a lot of factors. You can't, and not only that, you've got a whole lot of farmers in the US, Australia and all that under a lot of pressure, even in Europe, small farmers that are leaving the land because they just can't afford the fertilizers and all sorts of other things. So could this sort of magnify in effect? Could we see basically even in the West levels of hunger and, you know, undernourishment? Potentially, you know, things could really get worse. I don't think these people have really worked it out in their head. They've really stuffed these things up, you know, in terms of food security in Europe. Absolutely criminal. You know, energy security in Europe, absolutely criminal. And that's why they're in the mess. I mean, Europe is probably in the worst state out of all the West, out of all the industrialized developed countries. They're in the worst sort of state in that regard. I know that China's basically has been following developments for some time, and they've been storing and purchasing massive amounts in the open market. So they're actually using some of their own reserves to outbuy and outbid others. So even though they are dependent as well for a lot of imports, they're going to be slightly a bit more secure than other people around the world. That's just because they've got deep pockets, the reality. So you're in China, you're probably not, you're not going to be that at that sort of high risk as well. And they do have a lot of rice and other products that they domestically produce that they can shift towards. So there is that, and they would probably, being a sort of a government that they are, they'd probably limit exports as well of rice. So that will affect, you know, I mean, all those bodybuilders that, you know, rice and, you know, their carbs, well, maybe they should go on a steak and egg diet. It'll probably do them better for their health and, you know, leave a bit more for the other kibble eaters. Anyway, that's pretty much it as a supplemental. A few points that I had to cover just to sort of illustrate the sort of magnitude of this food crisis that's coming. You know, it's going to be big, guys. I'm not kidding you. It's going to be really big and massive. I don't think people have realized how bad it's going to get. And it's going to be very explosive around the world. It's going to really usher in a new political order in many countries or globally. Politics are not going to be the same after this crisis. And potentially it could create some really evil bedfellows in a number of countries, you know, sort of your type leaders promising you the world. We can save you as long as we can conquer somebody else's food supply, you know, that sort of a approach. So things could get quite nasty. Just keep that in mind. So take some measures at this stage for yourself and your families to sort of secure going forward. Also in terms of precious metals and stuff like that, things, there's an additional security. Try and actually, it's probably maybe too late for some people to try and reduce their debt levels, but, interest rates are going to definitely go up under these sort of circumstances, highly inflationary circumstances. It will drive, and it's energy and food inflation that is going to drive basically, interest rates. So not looking good. If you can basically get yourself out of that sort of situation, you can always come back in at a later stage and buy back at a lower price. If you can't, don't have many solutions for you. I'm just the messenger. So just giving you the information of what it's up to you guys to make your own decisions and live with those decisions, and utilize that information to realize these are very dangerous times and there are high risks here for all of us. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. See yous.